I just want to say a special hello to all my brothers and sisters who are going to be celebrating Indian Arrival Day this weekend. I know it's a special time, and this is why I'm presenting a program that is probably a little bit controversial, but I want you to stay with it. And of course, some of it is my opinion. And in this program today, I want to look at um, the extent of alcohol use in Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to also make a comparison with alcohol use in India as well. And I'll explain why in a little while. Because this is actually a true experience that I have had. And way back in 1979, I was still drinking, but I was attending a summer program sponsored by the University of the West Indies. And part of the coursework for that program required that myself with other few members, we formed a group, and each group had to do a research. And my group, we decided to do a research at the Alcohol Treatment Center, which was located at St. Anne's at the time. And out of that research, what we found was that 72% of the admissions and readmissions to the Alcohol Treatment Center were people of East Indian origin. And the majority of them came from County Caroni and County Victoria. Now, I was born and I grew up in County Victoria, in Gandhi Village in Davie, and I was now and currently still live in County Caroni in Felicity. So this bothered me a lot, being East Indian, coming from those areas, and I wondered why Indians were drinking so much, you know. And I think if anyone listening to this program, if you look at empirical observation, you will notice, yes, there's a very high incidence of alcoholism among the East Indian population in Trinidad and Tobago. When I went to work at the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Center later on in life, that fact was confirmed. Most of the patients coming in for alcoholism were East Indians, and some of the people, or the majority who were coming in for the other drugs like cocaine and so on, were mostly Afro Trinidadians. So this bothered me because I always, was curious to find out. This was a serious indictment on East Indians. So that in 1988, I had the opportunity to be a participant in the Caribbean Institute on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction, which was then coordinated by our eminent professor, Michael Berbrun. Dr. Berbrun was a psychiatrist, but he was a professor of great recognition. His opinions were very valued. In fact, he was one of those people who were able to persuade the Trinidad and Tobago government to begin seriously considering alcoholism as a disease and not as a moral issue or bad or social deviance. He was also able to get way back since those days to eventually get the breathalyzer law introduced in Parliament, and finally it was agreed, even though after his passing, they did eventually agree, and today we are using the breathalyzer in Trinidad and Tobago. But at that institute in 1988, which was held at the University of the Virgin Islands, as a participant, all the participants had to do a research paper and write a thesis, as it were, on a subject of their choice. And again, I did not give up on this whole question of why is it Indians were drinking so much? Because at that institute, Professor Berbrun had circulated a lecture he had presented earlier on in in the 1970s at the University of Benin. And in that paper, he sought to deal with this whole subject of drug use among East Indians in Trinidad and Tobago. And he gave a few uh, suggestions as to explain why East Indians were drinking so much. And some of the reasons he cited was, one, is that East Indians were not socialized into the appropriate use of alcohol. And when they came to Trinidad, alcohol being so readily available, they went overboard. And as opposed to that, the Italians and the French, who were socialized in the appropriate use of alcohol, who would take a drink of wine at dinner, they didn't have such a big problem with alcoholism. Now, that didn't sit too well with me at the time, you know. So I want to say that I was very grateful at the University of the Virgin Islands. There was a very good library, and I was able to do some further research. I got a book written by V.S. Raman, and in his book he was saying that, look, Indians have been crushing grapes since before Christ. In fact, there's the hill tribes in India were producing alcohol long before we in the Caribbean even had discovered Trinidad and Tobago. So that, to my mind, that did not really explain so much. And in Trinidad, there was and still continue to be a belief that it is something that has to do with our ethnicity, you know? And that, to my mind, was a little bit provocative, you know, because what ethnicity has had to do with that? And you know, it has become fashionable in this society in Trinidad, and some people may disagree with me, but a lot of people, even our people holding high office in this country were of East Indian origin, were often, you know, cited as having alcohol problem or being heavy drinkers and so on, you know, even without any proper proof, you know. And I have come to know now that I am not really qualified to say if someone is an alcoholic. Especially in Alcoholics Anonymous, you will hear members saying that only the person can say whether they are an alcoholic or not. So for anyone to be judgmental of another person, yes, as a professional, I can make an assessment and form a determination as to whether a person is alcoholic or not, judging from the stages of alcoholism that they might be presenting, the symptoms. But the average, you know, people here very glibly stick labels on other people. So coming back to my conversation about this whole question, in my research in the Virgin Islands, what I found though, and this was very interesting, I thought, and even Professor Berbrand, who read my paper, thought it was very useful and interesting, because even when I did my first degree in Jamaica, my interest has always been on this whole subject of alcoholism. You know, being a person in recovery myself, I'm always looking for ways to understand this problem and how to help my brothers and sisters. So my following, the only other person who had done a research in Jamaica on alcoholism and drug addiction was Professor Boram himself when he was attached to the Ward 21 hospital at the University of the West Indies. And following on him, I was going to be the other person. I was the other person who did another research in the whole of Jamaica on the question of alcoholism and drug addiction in Jamaica. And that was the subject of my thesis that I did for my first degree. And so that in the Virgin Islands, what I noticed is that not only East Indians in Trinidad were having a problem with alcohol or were going overboard, using it excessively to some extent, more than the other groups. what I found was that the North American Indians as well, the native Indians, they also had a very high incidence of alcoholism among them. And so too the Irish. They had a very high incidence of alcoholism among their populations. And it is a historical fact. What was common to these three groups? They were groups that were colonized. The Irish was colonized, the Native Americans were colonized, and the Indians who came to Trinidad, and even those who remained in India, were colonized, but more so, the Indians who came to Trinidad under the indentureship program suffered very severe conditions under the colonial system, the plantation system. And to debunk the whole question as to whether it had to do with ethnicity, I mean, the Native Indians completely of a different ethnicity, and so were the Irish to the Indians, but they all had this problem. And in Trinidad in particular, where the Indians and Afro-Trinidadians look over the fence at each other and say, you know, you are rum drinker and you are, you know, they'll banter each other. You are addict, you know, piper and all kind of thing. And working in the field of substance abuse, I am very familiar with what what goes on in those cohorts. So that, but if we look at Mauritius, an interesting example in Mauritius, where the Indo-Mauritians are in the majority and really control the levers of, of political power and life opportunities and all of that. And the Afro-Mauritian is in the minority as being decolonized. They had a high incidence of alcoholism. That led me to the conclusion that it did not have to do with ethnicity or where you came from, but it had to do more with your socioeconomic status, your relationship to the power structure. And what we saw was all these four groups were marginalized groups. And you know, up to last night, I was researching this subject using a lot of, even go on Chat GPT to get information and so on. And it is borne out that now it does not really have to do much with ethnicity, but it has to do with people's socioeconomic position. So that going back to our indentured ancestors who came here, and some will even argue that the conditions under which they came as scab labor. So they did not only receive the ire of the white masters, but also the rebuttal from the Afro-Trinidadians who were here before, the slaves, because they were coming to as though as scab, what happens when a trade union, you know, goes on strike, because the Afro-Trinidadians were protesting their life situation, and that is what led to the abolition of slavery. But the Indians were being brought in now as in competition with these people. And so the word, well, I don't want to get back to the N word and the C word, but those were very popular, and the East Indian immigrants really, really suffered at the hands of everybody, because you were the Johnny come lately, trying to take our job, take our opportunities. And they were relegated to some of the worst conditions. Even, you know, in another conversation 2 days ago, I was looking at the whole question of Gandhi Village, where I grew up. Do you know that place? That the original name for Gandhi Village was Kuliwood. And it was only in 1962 when we gained independence, on a suggestion from the Prime Minister at the time, Dr. Eric Williams, the community got together and made a decision to change that name because there was a certain stigma associated with the word coolie. Although in India, the word coolie still appears in the in the train stations and all of that, but it does not have that derogatory meaning as it connotes in Trinidad. In India, a coolie is a person who is a porter who will help you to carry your luggage from the taxi to the train and wherever and so on for a fee. And people, in fact, there was a movie made about Coolie Number One from this guy who was really very popular as a coolie. And but in Trinidad and the rest of the world, that word as the N word as well was highly stigmatized. And so the village got together and with the blessings of the then High Commissioner, Sri Munilalji, I feel proud to have been part of that movement in those days, to have the village name renamed to Gandhi Village. And today now, if you drive through Gandhi Village, you will see a statue of Mahatma Gandhi right where the train line used to pass. And again, this is thanks to a very good friend and neighbor of mine, Bobby Sinath, who is the CEO of the Mahatma Gandhi Charitable Organization, of which I'm a member as well. And this organization has been putting on cultural programs for the last 16 or 17 years in Gandhi Village, to the extent where a lot of young people who are on the entertainment circuit in Trinidad today were really discovered in Gandhi Village. And so too, there have been a cultural revival in Trinidad. And this station has really been one of those stations in the forefront of promoting culture, promoting social welfare, as indeed this program has been presented almost since the inception of this radio and television station as a public service. And the station again provides this airtime free of charge as a service to our communities. And not only the East Indian community benefits from this program. I must say I have calls from Afro-Trinidadians, people of every race, ethnicity, religious following. There's no bias here. People call because alcoholism and drug addiction is not a respecter of persons. It cuts across all barriers. Once you interfere with it, it doesn't care. Alcoholism and drug addiction does not really care whether you live in West Moorings or Federation Park or in Caroni or in Davie. It cuts across all barriers. So before we conclude this is a two-part program. Sorry. We will come back in the second half, and I want to look at some statistics as we compare and continue this discussion. And of course, anyone has any questions, you can text 7685925, or you can call me on any of these numbers, 671-3040, or after the program, if you have any questions or comments, or you can note them, as a lot of people have been doing it in the YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel. You type in my name, Ram Naresh Dwarika, Addiction and Recovery, and all the programs from the last 3 years are posted there. Every week there's a different program on different aspects of alcoholism, on where the treatment facilities are, what are some of the issues involved in drug addiction and alcoholism, and how to deal with it. Because this is an issue, no matter how much, I don't think we are ever going to be totally a drug-free nation, because we still have it legally available. The alcohol is still legally available. And even those drugs that are prohibited and with serious fine and imprisonment consequences, these still have not been able to make a dent, because the person who has become addicted, they will risk anything to get the drug supply. And this is why this is always cunning, baffling, and powerful. And hence the reason for this program, so that our listeners, our brothers and sisters there listening to this program can understand the nature of this problem, so they can better be able to deal with it. So we are going to take a pause at this point, And we'll come back in a few minutes and we will continue this discussion on alcoholism and drug addiction among East Indians in Trinidad and Tobago.